On November 12, 1944, a squadron of Lancaster bombers flew over the frozen fjords of northern Norway. Their target was the Tirpitz, the largest battleship in the German Navy. 42,000 tons of armored steel that the Royal Navy had been trying to destroy for 3 years. Midget submarines, carrier strikes, every conventional weapon in the British arsenal had failed. But strapped beneath those Lancasters was something the Tirpitz had never faced. A 5-ton bomb designed to fall from the sky at nearly the speed of sound. To understand how that bomb got there, you have to go back several years and meet the man who dreamed it up. Barnes Wallis was not a typical weapons designer. He had spent most of his career before the war working for Vickers Armstrong, designing airships and aircraft structures. He was a quiet, methodical engineer who thought in first principles. While other designers looked at a problem and saw what already existed, Wallis looked at the same problem and imagined what should exist instead. And in the late 1930s, as Europe stumbled toward war, Wallis started thinking about a question that almost nobody else was asking. How do you destroy a target that bombs simply cannot damage? The problem was real, and it was getting worse. Bomber Command's accuracy in the early years of the war was atrocious. Night bombing raids were missing their targets by miles, not yards. And even when a bomb did manage to land on a reinforced structure, the damage was often superficial. The Germans understood this. They were building submarine pens along the Atlantic coast with concrete roofs more than 20 feet thick. They were constructing underground bunkers for weapons factories. Traditional bombs bounced off these targets like tennis balls hitting a brick wall. Wallis proposed something radically different. He called it the earthquake bomb. The concept was elegant in a brutal sort of way. Instead of trying to hit a target from above and hoping the explosion would break through the armor, you would design a bomb so heavy and so aerodynamic that it would bury itself deep underground before it detonated. The blast would send a shockwave through the earth itself, cracking foundations and collapsing structures from below. You would not need a direct hit, you would just need to get close. The ground would do the rest. Wallis spent months running calculations in his study at home in Effingham, Surrey. He studied how shockwaves move through different types of soil and rock. He calculated how deep a bomb would need to penetrate before detonation to create the maximum seismic disturbance. And he figured out exactly how fast the bomb would need to be traveling at the moment of impact to achieve that penetration depth. He wrote the whole theory up in a 1941 paper with the typically understated title, A Note on a Method of Attacking the Axis Powers. The math was meticulous and the conclusions were staggering. To create a seismic effect large enough to destroy a major target, you needed a bomb weighing at least 10 tons. It had to fall from extreme altitude, at least 20,000 feet, to build up enough velocity. And it had to be perfectly streamlined so it would not tumble or lose speed on the way down. The Air Ministry read his paper, and their reaction was basically to laugh at him. A 10-ton bomb, dropped from 4 miles up. Nobody in the world had ever built a weapon remotely close to that size. The biggest bombs in the British arsenal weighed about 4,000 pounds, and even those needed modified aircraft to carry them. Wallis was describing something 3 times heavier. The engineering challenges were enormous, and the war was not going well enough for anyone to spend resources chasing what sounded like a fantasy. But Wallis had an advantage that most theorists did not. He had already proven that his unconventional ideas could actually work in combat. By mid-1943, his bouncing bomb, codenamed Upkeep, had been used in Operation Chastise. On the night of May 16th, modified Lancasters from 617 Squadron had flown at treetop height across the Ruhr Valley and skipped his cylindrical bombs across the surface of German reservoirs. 2 major dams were breached. Floodwaters roared through the industrial heartland of Germany, destroying factories, bridges, and rail lines for miles downstream. The Dambusters raid became one of the most famous operations of the entire war. After that, Wallis had something you cannot buy: credibility. The Dambusters raid was not just a tactical success. It was a propaganda triumph that made headlines across the Allied world. Newspapers in London ran the story for weeks. The aircrews were decorated by the king. And beneath all the publicity sat a simple fact that mattered more than any headline. Barnes Wallis had proposed an idea that sounded insane, built the weapon himself, and watched it work exactly the way his equations said it would. The Air Ministry was finally willing to take his earthquake bomb seriously. But there was still a practical problem. No aircraft in existence could carry a 10-ton weapon. The Lancaster could haul about 14,000 pounds, but a bomb that heavy and that long simply would not fit inside the standard bomb bay. So Wallis compromised. He designed a smaller version that a modified Lancaster could actually deliver. Still massive. Still unlike anything that had ever been dropped from an aircraft, but just small enough to be possible. He called it the Tallboy. The Tallboy weighed 12,000 pounds, 6 tons of high explosive and hardened steel packed into a casing 21 feet long and 38 inches in diameter. A standard British general-purpose bomb at the time weighed 500 pounds. The Tallboy was 24 times heavier, but weight was only part of the story. The shape is what made the Tallboy different from every other bomb in the war. Wallis gave it a smooth, tapered nose and a perfectly streamlined body. It looked nothing like the blunt, stubby cylinders that Bomber Command had been dropping by the thousands. It looked like an oversized artillery shell, and that resemblance was deliberate. The aerodynamic profile meant the Tallboy would accelerate cleanly during freefall, reaching a terminal velocity of roughly 750 miles per hour. That is close to the speed of sound at altitude. The tail fins were another piece of quiet brilliance. Instead of being mounted straight, they were offset at a slight angle. This gave the bomb a slow spin as it fell, about 60 revolutions per minute. The rotation stabilized the Tallboy the same way rifling stabilizes a bullet, keeping it on a predictable, nose-down trajectory all the way to the ground. Without that spin, a bomb this size would have tumbled wildly and become impossible to aim. This is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect. Because the Tallboy was not just a bigger version of a regular bomb, it was, in practical terms, a precision weapon. Decades before laser guidance or GPS, the accuracy came entirely from physics. The streamlining, the spin, and the extreme drop altitude combined to give the Tallboy a circular error probable of roughly 80 yards when released from 18,000 feet. In 1944, that was extraordinary. Most bombing raids measured their accuracy in hundreds of yards, if they bothered measuring at all. And when the Tallboy reached its target, it did not simply explode on the surface like a conventional weapon. It was fitted with a delayed action fuse. The bomb would slam through the earth or the concrete, burying itself as deep as 75 feet underground before the fuse triggered detonation. The blast would send a shockwave radiating through the soil, cracking building foundations and buckling structures that a surface explosion would barely scratch. Against reinforced concrete, the Tallboy could punch through 16 feet of solid material. Against open ground, it left a crater 80 feet across. Wallis called it the earthquake effect. And it worked exactly the way his math predicted it would. Of course, building the bomb was only half of the challenge. Someone still had to figure out how to get it into the air. The Avro Lancaster was Bomber Command's best heavy bomber. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. A maximum bomb load of 14,000 pounds. On paper, the Lancaster should have been able to carry a Tallboy without much trouble. In practice, the Tallboy was so long that it would not fit inside the standard bomb bay. The bay doors could not close around it, and the internal release mechanism was never designed to handle a single weapon this heavy, so the Lancasters had to be rebuilt. Engineers removed the bomb bay doors entirely, leaving the belly of the aircraft open to the wind. They reinforced the fuselage to absorb the stress of lugging 6 tons of steel at high altitude. They installed a custom bomb cradle and release mechanism. And because the open bomb bay created enormous drag which cut into the Lancaster's speed and range, the modified aircraft were stripped of everything that was not absolutely essential. Armor plating came out. The mid-upper gun turret was removed entirely. The rear turret was often stripped down or eliminated. The crews flew over enemy territory in aircraft that were essentially defenseless, relying on altitude and fighter escort to keep them alive. At 18,000 feet over occupied Europe, with no belly doors and a 6-ton bomb hanging in the wind. These Lancaster crews were some of the most exposed airmen in the entire war. The squadron assigned to carry the Tallboy was 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. By 1944, they were the most experienced precision bombing unit in the Royal Air Force. Their commanding officer was Wing Commander Leonard Cheshire, one of the most decorated pilots of the war. Cheshire had pioneered a technique called low-level target marking, where a fast de Havilland Mosquito would dive to rooftop height over a target and drop colored flares with pinpoint accuracy. The heavy bombers above would then aim their Tallboys at the burning markers. The combination of the most accurate heavy bomb in existence and the most skilled precision unit in the Allied Air Forces created something that had never existed before. A strategic weapon that could reliably destroy a single, specific, hardened target from thousands of feet above. This was not carpet bombing, this was surgical, and 617 Squadron was about to prove what it could do. The Tallboy's combat debut came on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the D-Day landings in Normandy. The target was the Saumur railway tunnel in the Loire Valley, deep in occupied France. German armored reinforcements were moving through the tunnel by rail, heading north toward the beaches where Allied troops were still fighting to secure their foothold. If those reinforcements reached Normandy, the entire invasion could be threatened. The tunnel had to be shut down immediately. 19 Lancasters from 617 Squadron flew over the French countryside, each one carrying a single Tallboy. Mosquitoes dove ahead and placed their marker flares. The bombers released. One Tallboy struck the hillside directly above the tunnel entrance, punched through 60 feet of solid rock, and detonated inside the tunnel itself. The explosion collapsed a section of the passage, burying an entire freight train under thousands of tons of limestone rubble. The railway line was severed completely. German reinforcements heading toward Normandy were stranded. A single bomb, one pass, and a target that conventional raids would have struggled to damage was permanently destroyed. But here is the detail that got overlooked in the moment. The Saumur tunnel was not even the kind of target Wallis had originally designed the Tallboy to attack. He had imagined it destroying dams, bridges, and fortified bunkers. The fact that it worked just as well against a railway tunnel proved the weapon was far more versatile than anyone had anticipated. Over the following weeks, 617 Squadron turned the Tallboy against an even more urgent threat, the V weapons. Germany's Von flying bombs were buzzing over the English Channel at all hours, their distinctive drone cutting out over London neighborhoods before the warhead plunged into streets and houses below. The V2 rockets were even worse. They arrived without warning, faster than the speed of sound, and there was no defense against them once they launched. Thousands of civilians were dying, and British morale was cracking under the strain. The launch sites and storage bunkers for these weapons were heavily fortified with thick, reinforced concrete. Previous raids with conventional bombs had barely left a mark. The Tallboy tore them open. At the Watton complex in northern France, a massive V2 assembly facility with concrete walls over 16 feet thick, previous raids had caused only surface damage. Tallboys cracked the structure wide open. At Wizenus, another V-weapon facility carved into a chalk quarry, Tallboys collapsed the quarry walls and buried the bunker under hundreds of tons of rock. At Mimoyex, which housed a battery of V3 superguns aimed directly at London, Tallboys sealed the underground tunnels for good. Target after target that had been declared indestructible was falling to a weapon that the Air Ministry had once dismissed as impossible. By autumn of 1944, Bomber Command had a new priority, and this one was floating in a Norwegian fjord. The Tirpitz was the sister ship of the Bismarck, which had famously sunk the British battlecruiser HMS Hood in 1941 before being hunted down and destroyed. After losing the Bismarck, the German Navy decided to keep the Tirpitz hidden in the deep fjords of occupied Norway, sheltered by mountains, anti-aircraft guns, and smoke generators that could blanket the surrounding water in minutes. The ship almost never left port, and that drove the British Admiralty to distraction. Because even sitting at anchor, the Tirpitz was tying down a huge portion of the Royal Navy. The British had to keep battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyer escorts permanently stationed in the North Atlantic just in case the Tirpitz decided to break out and attack the Arctic convoys supplying the Soviet Union. In July of 1942, the mere rumor that the Tirpitz had put to sea was enough to scatter convoy PQ-17. The merchant ships dispersed in panic and were picked off by submarines and aircraft. 24 out of 35 ships were sunk. Thousands of tons of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition meant for the Red Army went to the bottom of the Barents Sea. One German warship, doing absolutely nothing most of the time, was pinning down an entire Allied fleet and terrorizing convoys through reputation alone. Every single day the Tirpitz survived was a day those British warships could not be deployed to the Mediterranean, the Pacific, or anywhere else they were desperately needed. The Allies had already tried nearly everything. In 1943, Royal Navy midget submarines had crept into the fjord and placed explosive charges beneath the hull. The charges went off and damaged the engines and propeller shafts, but the ship survived and was towed to a new anchorage for repairs. In April of 1944, carrier-based aircraft hit the Tirpitz in a series of strikes called Operation Tungsten, scoring multiple bomb hits with standard ordnance. The damage was real, but not fatal. The Tirpitz limped south to Tromsø and started patching herself up again. Conventional weapons could hurt the Tirpitz. They just could not kill her. The deck armor was up to 5 inches thick. The torpedo bulges along the hull could absorb hits that would sink a smaller warship. She was anchored in shallow water, surrounded by cliffs, making torpedo runs from submarines almost suicidal. And the smoke generators could cover the entire fjord before a bomber formation had time to line up its approach. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense when you first hear it, because the solution to destroying a 42,000-ton battleship turned out to be a 6-ton bomb designed by a man who used to build airships. 617 Squadron launched its first Tallboy attack on the Tirpitz on September 15, 1944. The Lancasters flew from a temporary base in the Soviet Union because at that time the Tirpitz was anchored at Fjord, which was beyond Lancaster range from Scotland. 27 bombers made the long flight across the Norwegian Sea and approached the fjord at high altitude. The results were mixed. The Germans ignited their smoke generators, and thick chemical fog rolled over the water. But at least one Tallboy scored a near miss, detonating in the water alongside the bow and ripping a massive hole in the hull below the waterline. The explosion buckled steel plates and flooded compartments. Another Tallboy struck the bow deck and punched straight through the armor before detonating internally, wrecking the forward gun turret. The damage was severe enough that the Tirpitz could no longer make full speed. The German Navy accepted that she would never sail as a warship again, so they moved her south to Tromsø, where she would serve out the war as a floating artillery battery, a stationary gun platform to help defend Norway against a possible Allied invasion. And that decision was the mistake that killed her. At Fjord, the Tirpitz had been just out of range for Lancasters flying from Scotland, but Tromsø was roughly 200 miles further south, just close enough for a stripped-down Lancaster carrying a Tallboy with no armor and no gun turrets to reach from the Scottish airfield at Lossiemouth, drop its bomb, and make it home. The Germans either did not realize this or did not believe the British would attempt a round trip of that distance with a 6-ton bomb aboard. They were wrong. On the morning of November 12th, 30 Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron and 9 Squadron took off from Scotland in the pre-dawn darkness. Each aircraft carried one Tallboy. The weather forecast for Tromsø was clear skies. When the Lancasters arrived over the fjord, the smoke generators were either not operational or fired too late. The Tirpitz lay exposed against the dark water, her grey hull clearly visible from 18,000 feet. There was nowhere to hide. The Tallboys fell for nearly 40 seconds, spinning and accelerating in silence. 2 bombs scored direct hits. One struck amidships and smashed through the deck armor, detonating deep inside the engine room. The explosion blew a hole in the side of the ship that witnesses later described as large enough to drive a truck through. A second Tallboy hit near the stern, buckling the keel and flooding the aft magazines. At least one more bomb detonated alongside the hull, close enough for the underwater shockwave to tear open the torpedo bulges and flood additional compartments. Within 12 minutes, the Tirpitz began to roll. The flooding was catastrophic and completely uncontrollable. Water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle, and the ship began listing so severely that the crew could no longer stand on the decks. The ship capsized, her superstructure plunging into the shallow fjord floor while the red-painted hull rose above the waterline and pointed at the grey Norwegian sky. Sailors scrambled up the tilting deck and climbed onto the exposed hull as it rolled. Then the forward magazines detonated. Seawater had reached the stored ammunition, and the explosion sent a column of smoke, fire, and twisted steel hundreds of feet into the air. The blast was heard miles away. Of the roughly 1,000 crew aboard, most managed to survive by clinging to the hull or swimming to the freezing shore. Rescue teams later cut through the upturned hull plating with torches and pulled out survivors who had been trapped in air pockets below. But the ship was finished. The most feared warship in the German fleet had been destroyed by earthquake bombs dropped from over 3 miles above. Even while the Tirpitz attacks were underway, Wallis had already moved on to something larger. The Grand Slam. This was the full realization of his original 10-ton earthquake bomb concept. 22,000 pounds, 26 feet long. It required even more extreme modifications to the Lancaster, and it could only be carried by specially built aircraft designated the Lancaster B Mark I Special. The Grand Slam followed the same design philosophy as the Tallboy, scaled up to terrifying proportions. The casing was thicker, machined from a single piece of chrome molybdenum steel. The Torpex explosive filling weighed over 9,000 pounds by itself, and the terminal velocity was even higher than the Tallboy, pushing past the speed of sound in ideal conditions. When a Grand Slam hit the Earth, it burrowed roughly 100 feet deep before detonating. The resulting seismic shockwave was intense enough to collapse structures hundreds of feet from the point of impact. The ground itself would liquefy around the detonation point, turning solid foundations into something closer to quicksand. 617 Squadron first used the Grand Slam in March of 1945. One of the primary targets was the Bielefeld Viaduct, a critical railway bridge carrying supplies to the German front lines. Conventional bombing raids had hit this viaduct over and over again without permanently dropping it. The stone arches kept getting repaired between raids. On March 14th, 617 Squadron dropped a Grand Slam and several Tallboys on the Bielefeld Viaduct. The Grand Slam struck the embankment near a central arch, and the detonation sent a shockwave through the foundations. A 100-foot section of the viaduct collapsed into the crater. This time, there would be no repairs. The railway was finished. In the final weeks of the war, Tallboys and Grand Slams were aimed at the U-boat pens along the German coast. These submarine shelters had concrete roofs up to 23 feet thick, engineered specifically to resist aerial bombardment. And for most of the war, they had done exactly that. Conventional raids destroyed the towns around the pens and killed the workers who serviced the submarines. But the pens themselves shrugged off everything Bomber Command threw at them. Tallboys and Grand Slams ended that. They cracked the roofs, collapsed internal bays, and buried submarines under rubble. At the Fjord bunker near Bremen, a Grand Slam penetrated the massive concrete roof in a strike that German engineers had calculated was physically impossible. The age of invulnerable concrete was over. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, 617 Squadron had dropped approximately 854 Tallboys and 41 Grand Slams across occupied Europe. These weapons had destroyed targets that nothing else in the Allied arsenal could touch. Railway tunnels, V-weapon bunkers, viaducts, a battleship, and submarine pens had all been cracked open by Barnes Wallis's earthquake bombs. But what the Tallboy really proved went beyond any individual target. It demonstrated that a single, precisely delivered weapon could accomplish what hundreds of conventional bombs could not. Before the Tallboy, strategic bombing was about volume. Hundreds of aircraft, thousands of bombs. carpet patterns across entire cities, hoping enough ordnance landed close enough to do the job. The Tallboy reversed that logic completely. One bomb, one aircraft, one pass. Target destroyed. That concept became the foundation of modern air warfare. Every precision strike you have ever seen footage of on the news, every surgical hit on a bunker or a bridge or a command center, can trace its thinking back to what Barnes Wallis figured out in his study during the Second World War. The laser-guided bombs dropped over Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s. The GPS-guided JDAM that became the workhorse of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The bunker-busting GBU-28 used in the Gulf War. All of these weapons trace a direct conceptual line back to a 12,000-pound bomb dropped from a Lancaster over occupied France in the summer of 1944. And Barnes Wallis himself? He was knighted in 1968. He spent his later career working on advanced aeronautics, including early research into variable geometry wing design that influenced aircraft like the General Dynamics F-111 and the Panavia Tornado. He died in 1979 at the age of 92, still working, still sketching ideas, still looking at problems in ways that nobody around him had considered. The last Tallboy was dropped in April of 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender. In total, 617 and 9 squadrons used these weapons for less than a year of combat. But in that time, they reshaped what an air force could do. You can see a Tallboy at the Imperial War Museum in London today. It stands upright in a gallery, its smooth steel casing still looking sleek and modern more than 80 years after it was built. Near it, there is a photograph, black and white. The Tirpitz, capsized in a Norwegian fjord, her hull pointing at the sky, a 42,000-ton warship brought down by a weapon that the people who funded the war once said could never be built. That photograph tells you everything about Barnes Wallis. He saw a problem everyone called impossible, and he solved it with math, physics, and 6 tons of steel dropped from the edge of the sky. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like and leave a comment telling us which Tallboy mission you think was the most impressive. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button so you do not miss the next one.